I'm going to jump a little bit into the brain because you see what they're doing, how young those kids are. And if you think about it, at birth, we're born with all of our brain cells. Like we have all of our cells born at birth, but nothing's connected. So we have the synaptic connection, the neurons that need to come together. At 3 months, we have or 3 years actually, 3 months you have 1,000 trillion synapses. But at 3 years, the initial explosion occurs. So you can kind of, everybody here has somebody over the age of 3. So at 3, that's kind of where they kind of get grown up. You know, they're potty trained typically. They can kind of get their own things. Like they're starting to get a little bit more independence. That's because they had their very first neuronal burst that comes together and creates all the synapses that connects all of our cells together. And our brain really develops kind of from the back forward. So I had a neuropsychologist teach me this, but like if this is your brain stem and this is your limbic system, like your emotional regulation, that's really kind of in the center of your brain. That's our amygdala, that's everything that controls our emotion. And then you kind of have the 4 regions of the 4 different lobes of the brain that come over and develop over it. And that's really kind of in the heart and center. And that really is the part that when we're talking about development, those 4 lobes trying to connect together, that's what the synapses allow to happen. So the frontal lobe is the part that makes us short-term, long-term risk, and how we're actually going to get our kids to understand what our differences are for them if they make something today, 10 years from now. And we don't always have a really good grasp on that when they're really little because they don't have those synapses yet. They haven't developed. At 12 or 13, which I know there's some people in this room that have kids around that age and about to get there, that's really the shift between that last 3, you have that big burst, and at 12, 13, you have another big burst. It's the last development of synapses, like that it's explosive development, and it's related to puberty, like when that happens. And so you see a lot of impulsiveness at that time. You see a lot of like risk taking at that time because now they've got all of this stuff in there. And what happens is you throw in, it's like a big bowl of spaghetti, you throw in a bunch of stuff, and then you don't always use every strand, every connection, so it gets pruned down. So at 3, they prune down those avenues that they're not using. At 12 or 13, another big burst happens, and then they prune down again until about 19. And at 19 is really when myelination occurs. And myelination is a good example for that, I think that's been helpful for people, is like it's like having dirt roads. You know, the roads are kind of there at 18, like that after that pruning occurs, we know which roads should be there, but there's no pavement and there's no striping and there's no street lights. And so it's really confusing. And so at 19 is really kind of which is when kids are usually starting college, that's really when those are kind of happening and coming together. And then you really don't get the brain fully developed until 25 or 27. So you're out of college at that point, but that's really when the frontal lobe comes in together. And that's really where, if you're going to have conflict with a child and then they come back to you and then you have an adult relationship with them, it's typically after about 24 to 27, like where everything kind of comes together and they have perspective and they kind of get those things because now their brain's fully functioning. And if you think about when we're posting, our kids are posting way before any of that has happened. And they're putting stuff out there when their brain really doesn't have the ability to kind of understand those things. And if you, not just posting on social media, but if they're spending a lot of time online and they're not really interfacing with the real world, that part where you're pruning things together and then you're developing which pathways we're using. If you're using one pathway, which is, I have like classic is like gaming. A lot of my gaming kids, they're not using those pathways of interpersonal skill development. They're not using the muscular pathway, the pathway of the brain that actually puts together their coordination, because they're really not doing a lot of like sports. Because they'll pick video games and Netflix and anything online way before they're going to go play soccer in 90-degree heat. I mean, they're not going to do it. So knowing that that's important and understanding how that brain's developing for your kids and that they have to have that balance is super important when you think about it, because it's not going to get better until they get older. And that's not against them, but you could have a highly intelligent child, but emotionally that brain, right, is not developed. So they can be really smart and they can talk like they're adults in those little kind of moments, but it doesn't mean emotionally and the ability to weigh long-term, short-term is going to be there.